So what I'd like to do now is be transparent and participatory and take some questions from the audience. And I think now I know at least 20% of you, so I will call on you by name. Alex or Sarah? No?
Jay, can I have
Yeah.
one thing I forgot.
Sure.
While people are running to the microphones, one other thing Wendell Cochran has initiated is Exemption 10. We all know that the 1966 Freedom of Information Law has 9 federal exemptions, only 1 or 2 of which I particularly favor. But anyway, the 10th exemption we have decided is we don't want to give it to you. When there is no apparent reason for us not to get this, but somehow, so we have a blog now, and we're watching every time we see one of these. We're going to write Exemption 10. It's on the Investigative Reporting Workshop site, and you know, you got to have a little bit of fun here. So anyway, sorry.
So first, just as regards to the FOIA system, there's a startup actually founded by the Knight Foundation called Muckrock News out of Somerville, Massachusetts. And they're trying to set up FOIA as a service. And there's some really interesting questions about to what extent they could work with state, local, and federal government, maybe OGIS. I don't know what the opportunity there is. I think that to the extent that there are tools out there, I had an opportunity to talk to another investigative journalist last week, and he was talking about increasingly that other countries are interested in training their journalists to do these things. And he encouraged me to try to connect those journalists with technologists in the Valley. It's something that I can tap into somewhat with O'Reilly's network. It's kind of what we do. So to what extent do you think that there's willingness for journalists to work with technologists? Because this is kind of what you're talking about in terms of tools or platforms. And this might be a question for Mr. Allison, since Sunlight has actually been trying to train journalists. What are some of the cultural challenges that you've encountered in that area? You know, I hear this defense of the importance of media, the importance of, you know, good shoe leather reporting, the importance of institutions and you know, maintaining this, that it's not just data, there's all these other documents that, and I don't think people are questioning the importance of those institutions, but I do hear a cultural challenge in there. And when I've spoken to people in newsrooms and big papers, it's only recently that their data people are being pulled into the newsrooms at all, right? And now we're saying, well, save us. To what extent are there cultural issues, and how can they be surmounted? What are you hearing out there?
Boy, well, when I think of the cultural issue, I mean, the first one that comes to mind is kind of runs the other way, and it was a technologist I was talking to about a data set, and this was somebody who worked for government contractors and did not come from a journalism background at all. And I kept on finding mistakes in the data, and his response was, well, there's a 5% error rate, that's acceptable. And in journalism, there's a 0 acceptable error rate. So, so I think that's, you know, I think that one of the things, you know, that when I think about Sunlight, and you know, we have 18 technologists on the staff, we have a group now of 8 or 9 journalists, and early on, there was like a whole lot of difficulty in communicating. I mean, I think that one of my favorite things is the technologists would come to us and say, okay, we've got the data set, you know, what records do you want to see? We'd say, well, everything. And the response would be, well, no, we can't show you everything. What do you want to see? What's important? We kind of have this back and forth. Another thing that I learned very quickly is that you never say to a web developer, how hard would it be to? Never start a question that way. But you know, Sunlight does try to do a lot of training for journalists and to introduce them to different kinds of technologies, and we do things like, you know, some of this is very basic stuff, like, you know, how to use the Open Secrets database. Some of it is teaching them how to use CSS for, you know, web layout and things like that, and some of it is more complicated. We had for a little while a class just internally in Sunlight teaching journalists how to use Python. I think that the big hurdles to getting journalists to use technologists is one, or to get journalists and technologists I mean, first of all, it takes a lot of time to develop the technological acumen. And you think about most journalists who have, you know, 40-hour or more work week on deadlines and pressures and family and everything else, it's going to be hard to master, you know, computer languages and whatnot. So I think that that's one of the biggest hurdles. Secondly, I mean, I think that there's, you know, there's a lot of potential in tools like, and I'm thinking of things like, there was a website called cleanupdata.com, which is since, but you could do a very simple cleanup of data on this website. You know, you upload a spreadsheet, you want to change some things around. There are some online tools like Dabble and others, Socrata, that let you manipulate data online. So I'm thinking that, you know, in terms of, and then there's something like Batch Geo that lets you map data by just uploading a spreadsheet that's really simple to use. So there's some tools where journalists don't necessarily have to be developers, which I think are good bridges, but I think we need obviously a lot more of that. But generally speaking, I mean, you know, I think that, you know, that technologists aren't quite, there's still too much of a divide because technologists and journalists working together. I mean, I think that one of the most successful projects that Sunlight has been involved in from a bridging that gap is a project we did called Subsidy Scope, or that we're the technology partner for. And early on that, when a crusty veteran investigative journalist named Jim Morris was working with this data team, and they found all kinds of interesting things about Amtrak subsidies, highway payments, all kinds of other things that, you know, there's front page stories in the Wall Street Journal. The New York Times came out of this that they had basically uncovered by looking at this data and delving into this. And you had, you know, technologists working with a reporter, and they all worked in very close collaboration. They're all kind of stuck together in the same office, was on the 8th floor. And that was a partnership that worked really well. But I think that what made it work was that you had this very close-knit team working together. You know, they're building the website, they're looking for stories, and they're processing data. And I think that that's what was the most efficient thing. But I think you see that a lot in newsrooms already. The problem is that they're just, you know, that spreading it around, most reporters don't have access to these skills. And, you know, and I think that it's going to take time. But, you know, I think that the newsroom of the future will look very different from the newsroom today.
Other organizations, one that comes to mind in response to the question you're asking is IRE, Investigative Reporters and Editors, that has for years been conducting computer-assisted reporting workshops. So I just wanted to acknowledge that there certainly has been work done by them. I think they were long before sunlight was a gleam in anyone's eye working on that work. Oh, well, there you go. See, and you didn't even pay me to say that. There you go. And you're out of Missouri, is that right? There you go. And also openthegovernment.org, which is a coalition of many organizations that work on these issues, collaborates on a number of initiatives that are focusing on trying to get the government to, for example, have a floor of information that all agencies have to make transparent. And that's something we're still working hard at.
I also want to just briefly, two cultural issues. One is journalists want to tell stories. They will help build apps, but the apps have to have a purpose, which is to give the public, give their readers some information that they can use that they need to know. And I think that when you're talking about, you know, what can we do with the data, sometimes it takes so much work and effort to get the data into a usable format that then we put it online and then we forget about the harder part, which is what does the data mean? And I think that, you know, we've heard stories about how these data sets are being put together. I'm amazed you're taking 2, 3, 5, and 6 data sets when, you know, I did a project and we just built one data set, and that was all, took a lot of work to clean up. So I think that there is that challenge to how do you tell the story using the data sets. And then there's another challenge that I face when we're trying to do transparency advocacy and working with journalists, which is they don't want to talk about inside baseball. You know, how did I get the record? You know, that's something I can tell at an IRE conference and trade war stories. That's not something the public really wants to know about. We do think that's changing. You see efforts like Sunshine Week, where they're writing sidebars about how did we do this audit, how did we do this study, what were the challenges being faced. But it's still an evolving, I think, cultural issue.
One of the themes this panel is the role of private actors. And right now, universities are starting to be a source for R&D to develop the tools that would help the journalists try to analyze what government is doing. And in particular, if you think about the common challenges that reporters face, if I have 100 documents and I need to figure out who the names and entities are and what the surprising relationships are, and if I have 100 videotapes and I need to figure out where are certain images or words discussed, if these are about the war on terror, then that software has already been funded at Carnegie Mellon and Georgia Tech. And if it's about the city council, that software has not been funded. And in part it's because, at least at the federal level, if we think about public goods, national defense and education and healthcare are recognized as public goods. That's a technical economics term that doesn't mean I like it, therefore it's a public good. A public good is my consumption doesn't prevent you from consuming it, and you can consume it even if you haven't paid for it, and the market doesn't deliver public goods well. If you think about accountability as a public good, then if you step back, lots of different government agencies, even folks represented here, are working on tools that could actually help journalists. So for instance, at panel number 2 today, we heard about the great research that's open sourced that the National Archives is funding. So the National Archives is funding handwriting analysis of the 1940 census. That's exciting to me. You can tell I'm an academic when I say that. But how would that help journalists? Those disclosure forms that you talked about of state legislatures, they are often handwritten, not because these guys are great penmen, but because they know that it makes it hard for you to analyze. Or if you wanted to do...
At the federal level too, right?
Senate, that's right. Or even if you were trying to do the investigative story about who's buried in the National Cemetery in Arlington. And so the Archives is working on handwriting analysis in OCR. The National Endowment for Humanities has analyzed George Washington's handwriting and is looking for the Founding Fathers' handwriting. So government right now is producing software, and what, at least at Duke, what we're hoping through the actions of Sarah Cohn and others is to try to pull that research out and repurpose it. And it already has happened. Some of you probably are familiar with John King's Magic Board. Not related to this conference, but how he, on election night, is able to peer through. The origin of that was that the CIA's venture capital firm was having an industry fair. CNN paid $10,000 to go into the fair. They saw a couple of guys who had a battlefield map doing that, and they thought that battlefield would be great as an electoral battlefield. And so CNN hired those people away, and they created the Magic Board. And similarly on CNN, they took software that had been developed by a Harvard professor, Gary King, to analyze tweets in real time and sentiment analysis. And now, after the State of the Union, you can analyze real-time sentiment analysis from research that originally started funded from National Science Foundation because they wanted to help political scientists understand what government was doing. So your question about tools and journalists, I'm hoping that different parts of the government will realize how they can help develop these tools for journalists and how universities can also help stimulate that. Sure, question.
Hi, I'm John Powers. I work at the National Archives, and this last part has been a really interesting discussion for me. But what I'd be interested to do is take that question on its head a little bit and to see how, as NGOs, can help government agencies make this information available. Thinking about all the digital information that agencies are created now in an hour is more than they used to create in a year. And we're all going to be swamped with this digital, huge amounts of information. And eventually some of this will need to make its way to the archives, and we'll have to preserve it, process it. And there's no way we're going to be able to do this without being smart about how we preserve it and manage it. And it seems to me that as users and NGOs, you all should have a really good role to play in helping agencies on the front end decide how we can sort, manage, and use it so that it meets your needs. So I'd be interested in your comments.
I have one specific example. It seems obvious to me when it comes to government contracts, which as they're written currently, there is theoretically, and obviously we will all disagree with what is argued to be proprietary, but there is theoretically proprietary information scattered throughout it. And the first kind of thing that I think needs to change is the forms that are created in the first place need to have transparency as a part of the thinking behind the creation of the form, so that all the stuff that will go up online is all together, and that which can be argued about can then be separated and fought over, rather than having to fight over every single time. That kind of thinking, I think, hasn't permeated at the agency level yet. That's one example.
I'm not sure if this addresses your question, but I hope it may in some way. One thing that we try to do is educate Congress about how the process works and about what the challenges the agencies are going through. There is a huge disconnect, I think, between all of us sitting in this room who understand FOIA and the limitations and records management issues and doing the proactive disclosures, and what members of Congress see every Sunshine Week when they have a hearing on FOIA, and they're asking, wait a minute, a FOIA request comes in, the documents get sent out, why can't Danielle then see those documents when she's preparing her FOIA request? It doesn't make sense. Taxpayers have already paid for it once. You all have done the work. We need to see it. And you see that in the House and in the Senate. And you see it with both parties. So there's a huge disconnect. So we do try to educate members of Congress on the issue.
Yeah, Mark.
I just wanted to address that last issue real quick, that about journalists and creating tools. We have, there are a growing number of journalists who are doing that very thing. A lot of our members, particularly those who are involved with the National Institute for Computer-Assisted Reporting, which is also us. And at our last conference, which was last month still, I think, no, 2 months ago in Raleigh, we had more people than we've had in a decade at that conference talking about those very things. And we're seeing upticks in the number of journalists looking for training and basic tools. So I think you are seeing that movement. It's, and some of it's just people who have trained themselves and are working on their own time. Some of it's coming out of newsrooms. Some of it's coming from the new nonprofits that are dedicating some of their resources to this. But there is a movement along those lines, I think, and just wanted to make that point.
Thanks. Ken?
While he's going to the microphone, let me just add, I would love to see John King take his magic board and apply it to FOIA logs. Oh, look, we just got a request for the subsidy information. Oh, look, we just got DOD, just got a request. And, you know, do it in real time. It would be great.
More likely on C-SPAN, but yes.
That would be great.
Okay, and now for something completely different. As a citizen, one of the most rewarding experiences I had in federal government was in the area of geographic data. Most federal agencies have geographic data. Where are things? Where do things happen? I was appointed to what is now the Federal Geographic Data Committee in the early 90s. And what I found was a typical interagency committee where, in spite of a White House charge, they were all united in a common cause, which was to protect each agency's interests. So there was no real collaboration. All that changed when Clinton came into the White House, and it changed for the simple reason that the League of Cities and the Association of Counties and one other state local government group came to the Clinton White House and said, we need to be at the table with the Federal Geographic Data Committee. We need that data in our daily operations of government. We need it at a level of precision much more precise than what the federal government is doing to digitize the map of the United States. And the Clinton people took that to heart and rechartered the committee. And it was an amazing transformation where these federal managers got to see the value of collaboration, not simply to respond to the White House, but also because over time they'd think, I can actually get better data from a state or a county government than I could create within my own agency, or I could get it quicker or cheaper. So the question I have for the panel, and as a result, since the beginning of the Clinton administration, there has been very substantial progress in implementing common metadata standards and actual content standards of how that data is recorded, which makes it much easier to use that data in an intergovernmental context. Is there some other area where, if different levels of government got our act together, we could make it easier for the public to combine relevant data from different parts of government?
Mark, you're probably the best person, but I think that the National Institute for Computer Assisted Reporting, part of IRE, and I mean, and just in the journalism community, not counting the freedom of information community, which is, there's an overlap there, but there, I do think there's a insufficient collaboration with the freedom of information professionals about the types of data and how useful it would be for the public. I have to confess, I haven't been in many of those conversations, but I know that a lot of computer-assisted reporters, and Sarah Cohen has educated me on some of these, the data will be in a rough form, and as someone said earlier, you will make work to prepare it for the release, but it may take extra time and more money. And when things were going from paper to computer, reporters would say, can you just give us the disk, or make a copy of the disk? And that kind of street level, day-to-day communication would occur, but like on mapping and some of these other exciting things that are happening now, the GPS and all kinds of exciting things, I think there is a need for a greater conversation, frankly, between the government professional community and these private groups that are working with that data, probably most directly.
If I can address that too, I think there's a place that both state and local and federal and the public needs the most kind of interagency work is on entities. And what I mean by that is company names, individual names, county names, place names. OMB tries to put some standardization in there. We have a huge problem with unique identifiers for organizations. And it makes it difficult for even a local school board to know whether or not they're contracting with somebody who has been breaking labor laws. And so that's the kind of thing that across state, local, and federal government, that could be the same kind of revolution that GIS was. If I could just pick out one thing, that would be the one that I would choose.
And still pushing for tool development, if I picked one, it would be the ability to take audio, video, and search for the discussion of those names and entities, which is a problem for live web streamed legislatures and city councils, and even for our own U.S. Congress. Okay, last question. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm wondering if there might be a conflict between the open source, big batch data that people might want so they can manipulate, and Joe Q. Public just getting a PDF, oh, strange word, just to see the document. In other words, is one going to crowd out the other because the organized journalism profession and others want this really good complex data they can manipulate, but maybe many others, maybe teachers, local reporters, who knows, whatever, just want to see the basic, even the spreadsheet without the formulas or something like that. I'm just trying to figure how those things can mesh.
We want it all.
But I think it's important, I mean, I think you're right, it's important to be recognizing that there are different users with different needs, and that's part of why I just want to flag this concept that not everything that's important is data at all. And, you know, it's the same concept that I think we have different audiences that need to have access to all of these different formats.
And I think that if you make everything downloadable so that you can get access to, you know, the raw data and pieces of it and slices of it, you know, there's, you know, one of the things about the web that makes getting to data difficult is that, you know, you have web designs and, you know, you might have, well, here's a top 10 list, and I may be interested in company number 13 or company number 17, but and I think that goes to your example of, you know, you just want the PDF, you just want the information for your area, and making, you know, the data. Now, I think the difficulty with that is that sometimes if you have like 57,000 or 57 million records, there's no way the normal laptop or PC is going to be able to handle that, but there are different ways that you can make this data accessible so you can slice out a piece and get your zip code or get your county or get your town. It really depends on what the data is and how you slice it up. So.
And would it be simple enough for a private user to do that?
I just want to say
Sure.
that I think what the problem is now is that we're able to get the simple report for the one person, but the data behind it we can't get. So I wonder if it's really crowding out as I think that government has done, and this is David's point about retail versus wholesale. Government is doing a pretty good job on the retail level. You can go and look up a lot of things by your zip code, but if you want 4 counties, forget it. So I think that the retail level is being done pretty well right now, and it's a matter of going backwards to get to it.
To throw in a quick point to the processing question too, you're not stuck with your laptop. I mean, NASA can use JPL process a lot of its Martian images using Amazon's cloud. I mean, that's available as an on-demand resource to process unbelievable amounts of data in time that you could never ever do, even in some of the government supercomputers, without weeks and weeks of time. So journalists can just dump stuff into that now and get something back.
I always like to end on a note of optimism, and to me, one of the most optimistic things is that this discussion has been hosted by the archives, and the archivist is here. And you could really tell that the mission of this agency is to really push records out to journalists and make them more accessible. So I'd really like to thank the staff of the archives, the archivist, and this panel, and thank you. And in order to celebrate that, we have a networking reception outside. Thank you.